This is the story of the accidental trillionaires, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, and how a dying kid in a wheelchair made Steve Jobs and Bill Gates the richest man in the world, primarily Bill Gates, and how it all happened. The year was 1981, and in Boston we hired a programmer, Gordon Sterling, kid, teenager in a wheelchair with muscular dystrophy, very serious situation, to program a program called the Apple-IBM Connection, which took the Apple II Visicalc spreadsheets and moved them as a connection to the IBM PC 123 Lotus. This was a big deal because at the time the Apple II was a very successful microcomputer. It was the only good microcomputer at the time because the alternatives were pretty pathetic as business computers went. The Atari was a game, the Radio Shack was crashing all the time, and then the competitors came up to the Apple II, and they were the IBM PC and the Compaq. And at the time, all of Wall Street was running all of their spreadsheets in Visicalc, which was a spreadsheet program for the Apple II. The problem with the Apple II was that the chip, which was a 6502, was a weak chip compared to the 8088 of the IBM PC, which was a 16-bit chip. And it was running 123. But there was no connection. If you had thousands and thousands of spreadsheets like Wall Street had for Apple IIs with Visicalc, there was no way to move them to an IBM PC running Lotus 123. I came up with that idea, and I needed a programmer to do it. So we went to the Boston Computer Society, got up and announced that we were looking for a programmer, and Gordon Sterling and Steve Zagiboilo got up, and we hired those two kids, and they wrote this program called the Apple-IBM Connection. The Apple-IBM Connection moved files with what was called StirZag units for Sterling and Zagiboilo. It was painfully slow because at the time Gordon Sterling, the kid in the wheelchair, had access to a very specific card for communication called the Mountain card, which was very esoteric. It was 180 bucks, and nobody had it. And we connected this with a normal serial port in the IBM PC, and it was moving data, I recall it, something like 186 bytes per second, which was pretty slow. It took hours to move a floppy full of spreadsheets. We used to get calls from many investment houses in New York City. Can't this go any faster? We've got 10,000 disks to move. And we were like, hey, you got to buy more PCs and more Apple IIs to move it. I remember when Dan Filstra, the vice president of Visicorp, which had Visicalc and VisiWord, and later on Vision, which never came out. It was always, Vision was supposed to be like an all-in-one integrated. Came to our offices in Burlington saying, how much do you want for this program? Because it was killing Visicalc. At the time, Steve Jobs was very busy with, they had come up with the Apple III, but the Apple III was crashing all the time. And even though it was fast enough, it was not reliable. Steve Jobs was very busy with his daughter Lisa. He was rediscovering personal stuff in his life, and he wasn't paying attention. And the Apple III got a reputation for crashing. The IBM PC, on the other hand, was stable. It was well priced. It was nice and well received, and we made it happen that the spreadsheets were able to move. Well, Gordon Sterling lived in a wheelchair, and Steve Zagaboilo, who was another accomplished programmer, helped him everything, you know, go to the bathroom. Gordon was in trouble, and prognosis was not good. Very charming, the two fellows, very young. I think they were 17 or 18 at the time, and it sunk the Apple II, and it made the IBM PC a success. At the time, Gates was giving Microsoft to IBM practically for free. And, you know, at the beginning, DOS couldn't do anything. In fact, I remember being in a meeting with Jackie Morby and the president of Compaq and Ben Rosen, the guy that funded Compaq and Apple and Intel. And at the time, Microsoft was selling a chunk of it. They needed money, and Microsoft was competing with Digital Research, which Jackie Morby at TA Associates had funded. And Digital Research had a multitasking operating system in 1982. And Microsoft didn't have diddly. They had DOS and BASIC, crashing. It was pathetic. And Jackie Morby asked me, do you think we should buy them out, you know? Because Microsoft was, you know, giving away DOS for free, and Digital Research, which had a true program, was charging, and nobody was buying it because, you know, Microsoft came with the IBM PC for free. At the time, they had a shoe salesman in charge of the IBM PC sales. They were selling at the Sears business centers. So, and you know, there was a lot of synergistic competition between Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, because without each other they couldn't have done it. For example, Bill Gates had the inkling to give it away, and because, you know, Steve Jobs would have never given it away. He would have kept it as an elitist thing, which would have stopped, slowed down the computer world. But Steve Jobs was always there to inspire and to keep up the class act that Bill Gates on his own could have never had, because, you know, Microsoft always, you know, with their you know, inferior kind of approach, and Apple with their elegant elitist approach, and the two of them teased each other. Now, you know, Apple's worth as much as Microsoft or more, and the combined value of them is 600 billion, which any you know, Wall Street good person would double it, and thus their value is more than $1 trillion, and that's the accidental trillionaires. And you know, this kid in a wheelchair was the one that took it away from Apple. Apple had it. The Apple II was the king, and moved it into the IBM PC with this program, the Apple-IBM Connection, which I came up with the idea, but Gordon Sterling and Steve Zagaboilo wrote it. We marketed it, and that was the moment where things happened. So, you know, I told Dan Filstra, the vice president of Visicorp, that we wanted $500,000 for the program, and he walked out of our offices. But those were the days, and that was the story. And you know what? Steve Jobs and Bill Gates never heard of this dying teenager in his wheelchair who put him together in such a way. Without that kid, Bill Gates would have been the pathetic owner of a small programming shop, because Apple would have continued to rule with their beautiful Apple II. Steve Jobs would have had the time to fix the Apple III. Visicalc would have been the king, not 1, 2, 3, Lotus 1, 2, 3. And the world would have been different, but elitist. And it was that dying kid in a wheelchair that made it. And both of them, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, have never heard of Gordon Sterling, who was the guy that wrote the Apple-IBM Connection. And that was 1982 Boston. So that's the story. the accidental trillionaires.